We are back at it with a one-on-one interview. Today we are joined by quite possibly the largest man currently in the UFC, a product of Dana White's Contender Series, Juan Adams. Juan, how are you?
I'm doing well, man. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Juan, I just mentioned that your size is something that makes you do what not a lot of guys have to do in cutting down 20 plus pounds to hit that 265 limit. I've heard you say after a fight that sometimes you do get up close to that 300-pound range. How early prior to a fight is it that you start to try and shed a few of those pounds?
Pretty much as soon as I know I have a fight, I try and keep it low. After this past fight, I didn't really get that heavy. I cut my weight at 285, and I kind of started training and sticking to a diet again.
Nice. Is that something that moving forward you're going to try and keep a little bit lower than what you have in the past now that you are getting consistent fights in the UFC?
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Good stuff. And we also referenced there that you are a product of the Contender Series, which for a lot of people has really taken over from the Ultimate Fighter as what is the path to the UFC. And looking back on that experience, how did the pressure of being directly in the UFC's spotlight compare to maybe previous fights that you had had in Legacy Fighting Alliance?
Um, it was a lot different for sure. I will say that it was very different. It wasn't a whole lot of pressure though because I had so few fights when I went on Contender Series that I was actually under the impression that I wasn't going to get signed even if I won. So, um, I went out there and I was really just there for the experience to really take a step up in competition. And having Dana White there and Mick Maynard, I had fought in front of Mick before, but never Dana. So it was a little bit more pressure, but it's not really it wasn't. I didn't really notice it all that much, especially with Contender Series because it's kind of like you're going into a gym. There's people there, but it's not a huge crowd. It's pretty much like for me, I went into it like it was a really hard sparring match.
Yeah, fair enough. And there you did mention Mick Maynard, and throughout this week, I was reading things about your past and whatnot, and I did see in there that the story of how you actually got onto the Contender Series is kind of a funny one in and of itself. You were at an LFA event, and then Mick Maynard came up to you and said, "Hey, I think we can get you onto the Contender Series." Is that kind of how it went down?
Yeah, pretty much. My manager had mentioned it in passing, and Mick was at these fights that I was at, and he came up to me and was just like, "Hey, yeah, I think we can get you on Contender Series. Why don't you come over tomorrow and we'll talk about it?" Because he was in town. So I just went over to his place the next day, and there were a bunch of other fighters there, and we talked about it. And then my manager talked to him, and a few days later we had our contract.
Well, it's not a bad introduction to getting into the UFC. Exactly. Being invited over to Mick Maynard's house isn't something that I'm sure a lot of guys that are even currently in the UFC have had the opportunity of doing. So, a great way to, so to speak, get your foot in the door. And if you do go back, even before you made your MMA debut, you were wrestling in college at the Virginia Military Institute, and growing up, you played football, you did track and field. For a guy who I would presume was always quite big. You are as athletic as they do come. And how did this translate when you did start getting into MMA, being that athletic?
Um, it translated really well for me because there was things that I could just pick up a little quicker than other people, and I could always in sparring and stuff, people were always shocked at how quickly I could move, and it being in that athletic field beforehand, kind of I knew that I knew what it took to be good at anything. I knew how to train hard already, and so all that just kind of translated really well and allowed me to really hit the ground running really quickly with all everything in this sport.
Yeah, and on the note of talking about that athleticism, and if you talk about training and things like that, you had the opportunity to try out with the Green Bay Packers and with the WWE. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
And so are wrestling and the NFL, are those things that you enjoy outside of fighting, or was that something that again just came down to your athleticism?
I had a football was my first sport, but I didn't play in college. My college team it wanted me to play, and yeah, I went out for spring football, and I really just didn't like it. So I just didn't try and pursue it anymore at that point. But a couple of NFL teams had seen some of my wrestling tape, and they had programs in place um, for like project athletes. So they that piqued their interest. And then the WWE thing, yeah, I had always liked it beforehand. I never thought I would get a chance to try out for it. So it was really cool to go out there, but it was something that just kind of came up because of my athleticism.
Yeah, and those things, those are again based off of the fact of when people saw your size, they saw your athleticism. It's not something that people do get to see every single day. So the fact that you're able to get those opportunities doesn't surprise me. And when you do start talking about your athleticism and whatnot, and how you've developed, you still are somebody who is very young in the fight game. Like you said, you didn't have a ton of fights prior to getting onto the Contender Series. Do you see yourself still just continuing to grow at a very rapid pace, or is it something that has started to slow down a little bit for you?
I do see myself continuing to grow at a pretty rapid pace. Um, Obviously it will slow down at some point. It hasn't yet, but I really do think it's going to continue for a while. Like this week, first time I've really spent a whole lot of time dedicated to jujitsu. I'm at this Globetrotters jujitsu camp up in Maine, and I think I'll see a lot of growth there. I think I'll see vast strides and vast improvements in my game, and I'm really hoping that that kind of continues, and I hope it doesn't slow down anytime soon, but it probably will.
Yeah, it is something that exactly when you are at the level that you're at, you do love to obviously see that continued growth, and you do love to see that happen at a rapid pace. But like we did talk about it, at some point when you are at that high of a level, it's bound to slow down a little bit. But here's to hoping and well wishing that it does continue at a rapid pace. But a couple more here before we do get into your next fight and your next opponent. It's well talked about that you don't watch tape of your opponents. You've mentioned that you almost start to feel bad for them before the fight even starts. And is watching the UFC and watching fighting at all a part of your life, or do you try and get away from it when you're not competing? And if so, what is it that you enjoy when you're outside of martial arts?
I watch it. I typically try not to watch cards that have other heavyweights on it because I'll have to fight them eventually. But I do enjoy watching it sometimes. I don't like watching it with people that don't really know the sport because then it turns into them asking me questions the entire time, and that's not why I watch anything. But outside of it, I enjoy, video games. I really like anime quite a bit and movies. I go see movies probably 2 or 3 times a week. And, I read comics, huge sci-fi and fantasy fan. So Game of Thrones, all that. I watch a lot of Criminal Minds as well. So I do, I have a lot of things to pass time.
Yeah, I was just gonna say as you started to say what you were into, I was gonna say you obviously must be into Game of Thrones, as it seems everyone who you do meet these days is when you do talk about movies or anything like that, is there anything that kind of sticks out recently that you would say is on the must watch for people?
I thought Aladdin was really good. I like that movie quite a bit. And let's see. Obviously Avengers Endgame was awesome. Love that movie. Spider-Man Far From Home should be coming out pretty soon. So that's one that's really on my must-watch list. But other than that, I just kind of watch all of them.
Right on. So it does sound you're a bit of a big kid at heart, so to speak, eh?
Oh, definitely.
Right on. And one even with your wrestling background, you're somebody who finishes your fights. with the only time that you've had a decision being a loss, albeit a controversial loss, your last fight against Arhan Buller, and going the distance in May, was there a lot that you were able to take away from that and things that you did learn in having a fight go to a decision?
Yeah, I could definitely go learn to go the distance. Obviously, we'll have to work on, the urgency in the fights, so to speak. But uh, it was one of those things where you're kind of just. I'm still learning a lot. I'm learning that during that fight, I kind of showed up and I was a little flat. Both my UFC fights, I was a little flat. It kind of the real, I don't know, the intensity wasn't there, so to speak. But I guess it's kind of because I reached the goal, so it was a little harder to get motivated, so to speak, for those ones. But the other than that, man, I just learned that when you go into when we knew this going into it, when you go into someone else's home country, you got to beat them pretty convincingly to get that win. And I guess I didn't do it convincingly enough. So I was upset by the decision, but I didn't win in a way that I feel I won the fight, but I didn't do it in a way that, was going to make me go scream, I was robbed and all that.
Yeah, and we've seen that before, and I've talked about it with many fighters. I talked about it with Eric Anders recently about when it does go to the judges, and especially when you are in somebody's country, like you said, we've seen it with even the Darren Till, Stephen Thompson. That was something that was quite debatable. And I spoke with Cajun Johnson a few weeks ago, and he was talking about in his last fight in Russia how it was unbelievable that the judging had gone that way. In the future, do you see any development or any changes that MMA could make in terms of judging, whether it be you would hate to say going to a computerized scoring system, but do you see any changes that would take away that human error?
No, I don't. At the end of the day, as long as you have humans judging it, there's going to be room for that error. Obviously, I would like for there to be, an across the board class or something that all refs have to go to. But the way it is right now, in any state or any country you go to, it's going to be based on, what martial art what martial art was most prominent in the past in that state or that country. So, if I had that fight in Vegas, they probably would have scored it for me because it's more boxing centric. But it's one of those things that since MMA is such a new sport, it's really been only in the spotlight the past 25 years or so. There's a long way to go, and there's gonna be a lot of growth, and between officials, fans, and fighters. It's constantly changing. So it's one of those things where it's gonna take time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And myself, I am somebody who, in all sports, not just in MMA, I do believe that human error is always going to be a part of it, and to try and eliminate that would really take away from the sport in a sense. I think it's the way that it's always been, and you hate to say it's the way that it's always going to be because things are obviously going to develop and things are going to improve, like you touched on. But human error, I think, will always be there. So. And one, we couldn't talk and not bring it up. July 21st, in your home state of Texas, you're fighting Greg Hardy. Since his debut, this is somebody who you've been full force, all in on your dislike and displeasure for his opportunities, him as an individual. You've mentioned that he's stupid and delusional for comparing himself to Michael Jordan. What started this, and just how happy are you to finally get inside the octagon with him on July 21st?
Oh man, it all started honestly because we were around the same time both of us started MMA. You know, everyone's talking about how much of a powerhouse he is and how good he is, but you got to take into account he was fighting clowns. His first amateur opponent was 44 years old. His second amateur opponent was 42 years old, and I was like, anybody can knock those guys out in a minute. That's not hard to do. But it was just like a sideshow attraction. Really, it was like circus fights. And I thought it was dumb. I didn't think he deserved the amount of push that he was getting. And we were both with LFA at the time. You know, we were both with LFA. So there's plenty of opportunities where we could have fought, and we didn't, you know. And that's his people protecting him. That's his managers protecting him. And different organizations protecting him. Then, you know, when he finally did go pro, I was already 3-0 as a pro, I think, or 2-0 as a pro. But he had just done an amateur fight with LFA and talking about going pro. So I was like, yeah, I'll fight him then. So there's been plenty of opportunities for us to fight, and they've avoided it. And so for him to go and talk like he's so great and all of this, where he's picking the easiest opponent possible at every opportunity. And I'm not getting that chance. I'm having to fight whoever's going to fight me. And all the times the guys that are fighting me are way more experienced. And so I just thought that rubbed me the wrong way for everyone to constantly be talking, you know, about all this potential and stuff that he had or how great he looked off of those fights when he wasn't really fighting anyone. And now, you know, for me, every point people are telling me I should have fought him. I should have fought him. Well, why haven't you fought Greg Hardy? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And people are comparing me to him. And I'm just like, man, I fought, you know, before I got signed to Contender Series, I think in 16 months I had fought 7 times, something like that. It's not like I was hiding from anyone, you know. I was taking every fight given to me. And so that rubbed me the wrong way, and it just pissed me off, and it really put a sour taste in my mouth. And then for him to get signed after me and then get a fight before me, and for him to continue to get a quick turnaround, and that's all I was asking for this whole time. Yeah, that made me dislike him quite a bit. And so that's just kind of where it grew, and it's been festering ever since, you know, especially after his last fight. He was fighting, you know, like I said, a bum. And he's trying to act like he's all that, calling himself the Michael Jordan of mixed martial arts and shit like that. It really put a sour taste in my mouth.
Yeah, I really do think that last fight against Dmitry Smolyakov, I think that left a sour taste in absolutely anybody who's ever watched MMA prior to his mouth, because that was something that looked like it was a sideshow. That looked like it was something that you would see at a carnival. I mean, Smolyakov really gave out zero offense, put no output towards it, and like you said, Greg Hardy was walking away from that claiming to be. Somebody who, if you're comparing yourself to Michael Jordan, you're arguably the greatest in your sport. So it's not a slight at Alan Crowder in any way, but I mean, like you said, these aren't top name opponents that he is fighting, and it's something that, yeah, I would love to see him, and I'm sure a lot of fans would love to see him get challenged as well. So. You did mention there you had 7 fights in 16 months, and I was looking earlier at it, looking back on your Instagram, and I believe it was 7 fights in 16 months with a total of 18 minutes and 54 seconds of total cage time. So it was an impressive run, to say the least, against, like you said, very tough opponents.
Yeah, and you know that's the other thing. People want to say that, you know, the records of my opponents weren't that great, but you also have to take into account I was 1-0, 2-0 at the time, fighting guys with, you know, 10 MMA fights and other pro boxing fights on top of that. And, you know, even in the UFC, my opponents had wins in the UFC when I fought him, and he's fighting guys that were winless in the UFC. Alan Crowder, you know, granted he was 0-1, so he's not a bad guy. I'm not slighting him in any way, shape, or form. But the fact of the matter is he was 0-1 in the UFC when he fought Greg Hardy. And then his second opponent was 0-2 in the UFC when he fought him. Whereas my second opponent in the UFC is Arjen Bueller, who is good. You know, he's a legit prospect or contender, so to speak. He's 8-1 overall, 3-1 in the UFC. Like, I just feel that my competition has been way better than his.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and that's why I do think that seeing this happen on July 21st, I think you have the opportunity to truly be the first person to derail the hype train that the UFC has created in Greg Hardy. And I know that when it does come into San Antonio, you're going to have a lot of fans there. And whether or not people know who you were, I think you're going to gain a lot of fans at that fight. And I think you're going to gain a lot of fans leaving that fight as well. So, Juan, thank you very much for making the time today. I do really appreciate it, and I really look forward to that fight July 21st. And like I said, seeing you finally be able to get your hands on somebody that you've waited so long for.
Thank you, man. Have a good one.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That is Juan Adams, guys.